"Mommy, why did you leave me here?" Sarah cried softly, sitting by her mother's grave. Today, her mother had gone to the city to sell milk, eggs, and everything else they had on their farm. Many things had changed in their village, and everyone believed it was the farm that had ruined the beautiful Amanda. Once, she had been in love with a young man, a handsome, smart, and kind one. They had planned to get married, but it never happened. He died in the forest while hunting. It took several months for the villagers from the nearby village, close to the forest where the young man perished, to find his body. Amanda gave birth in a place where there were strict laws, and everyone condemned her. Her father had thrown her out of their home, and she set off wandering the streets with her newborn daughter. Suddenly, a villager named Chris took her in. They say Chris had been in love with her for a long time. It was a stroke of luck for him. The man didn't miss his chance. At that time, they had 3 cows, a sow, sheep, and poultry, along with a large garden. Then, Sarah's mother fell ill when Sarah had just turned 10. The girl sat by her side, crying, and her mother held her hand and whispered urgently, "Sarah, my dear, as soon as you get your passport, run to the city. People there will surely help you." Sarah cried out, "But what about you?" She desperately wanted her mother to run away with her, but her mother only smiled and said nothing more. After the funeral, Sarah lay there, staring into space, and Chris entered the room. "Why are you lying down, Sarah? The animals haven't been fed. Have you really become that lazy? Don't forget about the orphan. Nobody will throw her out on the streets. Just so you know, you won't eat until you've worked off your upkeep," Chris said. Sarah slowly got up and went outside. She returned home well past midnight. The next morning, Chris woke her up as soon as the sun began to rise. "Enough sleeping. Your mother left us. Come on, go work. From now on, you'll be working. Get ready. You can have a quick bite, and then start weeding the potatoes. I'll go to the city for my personal matters. In any case, I'll return to make sure all the work is done. And don't forget about the livestock," Chris ordered. Sarah glared at him with resentment, sipped her tea, and headed to the garden. The village was just beginning to wake up when her hands were already covered in calluses from hard physical labor. Sarah straightened up, and by the fence, a neighbor stood, looking at her with pity in her eyes. "Poor girl, starting work so early. Did Chris make you do this?" the neighbor asked. "Hello, Chris told me to weed. He went to the city," replied Sarah. "A cursed farm, always relying on someone else, isn't it?" the neighbor commented. "I don't mind. After all, I live here," Sarah answered. The neighbor decided to help Sarah and called her children. They came over, and together they decided to assist Sarah for a couple of hours. Within 2 hours, they had nearly finished and went to the neighbor's house. "Come with us, we'll feed you at least. After that, I'll help you tidy up." By the time Chris arrived, everything was ready. Sarah was sitting on a bench, resting, and he pulled up in his old car. He looked disapprovingly at her but didn't yell. He decided to see what was done and what wasn't first. He went through everything, checked, and then returned to her. "You didn't work much. You're just sitting there, not doing anything. Tomorrow, I'll give you more household chores," he said. Sarah almost cried. In the evening, she sat on the bench. The neighbor who had helped the little girl passed by. "Sarah, what's happening to you? Did that Chris force you to work again?" the neighbor inquired. At that very moment, the homeowner himself appeared. "You don't understand a thing. I'm raising her this way. Even though she's not my own daughter, she'll be grateful later. There's no time for nonsense. What if Amanda gets pregnant, and the child's father leaves her?" Sarah lunged at him with her fists. "Don't you dare speak ill of my mom," she yelled. Chris wanted to strike the girl, but the neighbor shielded Sarah. "What are you doing? Just you wait. I'll call the police," the woman warned. After some time, the neighbor went back to her own home, and that's how Sarah lived. She became thin. Her school performance suffered greatly because she could only do her homework at night, once all the chores were completed. When Sarah turned 15, a wealthy man named Mark arrived in their village. He had sold some cows and brought them to the village. Chris looked at these cows with intense desire. He had never seen such valuable livestock. He approached the pen, and his insatiable greed was evident in his eyes. Chris spotted the owner and approached him, inquiring if he could buy one of the cows. The price turned out to be exorbitant, but Chris refused to pay that much. That's when an idea occurred to him. He had heard that wealthy people were so bored with life that they didn't know how to entertain themselves. Many said that this man, Mark, was rich but had no wife, and that's when Chris's plan formed a way to acquire such a valuable cow for his farm. Throughout the night, he mulled over his plan and, come morning, he set out to meet the wealthy man, who watched him with interest. Mark had been slowly studying the villagers and planning to set up production, so he wanted to know whom he would have to work with. No one had a good word to say about this man. He was greedy and made the orphan, Sarah, work, although he hadn't kicked her out of school. This was because he knew the harsh conditions under which she had to study. Mark was taken aback by what Chris proposed. He even asked, "Am I mistaken? Are you offering your stepdaughter's innocence for such a cow?" "Exactly her innocence," Chris confirmed. Mark wanted to strike the audacious man in the eye, but he restrained himself. He decided that if he started the deal, he would conclude it with someone else. "You go home, and I'll think about it," he said. In the evening, Mark returned to Chris. He signed some paperwork. Sarah understood that the discussion revolved around her, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. Finally, when the people left, Chris called her into the room. "Sarah, pour some tea. There's a cake in the fridge. Bring it," he said. Sarah understood that this was not an ordinary conversation and grew frightened. Chris spoke so kindly that she almost didn't recognize him. They even had tea, and Chris asked about her schoolwork. Then he got to the point. "Tonight, you'll go stay with the new farmer," Chris said. Sarah didn't understand what he meant. "But why?" she asked. "That's how it is. In exchange for your innocence, we're getting a cow," Chris announced. Sarah almost collapsed. Tears welled up in her eyes. "No, I don't want to," she said. "What do you mean you don't want to? We've already made a deal with Mark. Think about it. What difference does it make to you? And for such a cow," Chris said. "I don't want to," Sarah whispered. "Enough. I've spent half my life taking care of you. Your mother deceived me. She could have lived well, helped with the farm, but no, she ran away and left you with me," Chris said. Sarah wiped away her tears, but there was nothing left for her to say. Chris continued to persuade her, but she knew she couldn't refuse. An hour later, a car arrived. Chris was thrilled. They got into the car, and it headed toward the city. Chris remained silent, while he caressed the beautiful new cow. 2 weeks later, the village became agitated. People came to Chris's house. He stepped out onto the porch and asked, "What do you want?" "Chris, where is Sarah? What have you done with her?" the people inquired. "Why is it any of your business? Go sort out your own families. Stay out of mine," Chris replied. At that moment, he locked eyes with the husband of the neighbor who had helped Sarah. They rarely spoke, but the neighbor's husband looked at him with anger in his eyes. They all knew that nobody wanted this brute to explain anything. People advised Chris, "You need to answer when the villagers ask questions. They might get angry." Chris got scared but said nothing. The crowd grew anxious, and at that moment, a new and wealthy farmer named Mark's Jeep appeared on the road. "Stop him," the people shouted. The men rushed towards the car, and Chris attempted to escape. However, the neighbor who had assisted Sarah grabbed onto him and began screaming, claiming that a horde of women had piled onto him and stopped the man. Half an hour later, Mark arrived. In the car was a woman around 40 years old and Sarah, looking beautiful, neatly dressed, and well-groomed. Sarah gazed back at Chris's house with fearful eyes, while the woman held her close. Mark glanced darkly at the gathered crowd. Suddenly, one of the villagers yelled, "We know that Chris sold you an orphan. We know he's a bad person." The people were taken aback. Sarah suddenly broke free from the woman's embrace and said, "Enough. Mark saved me, and this is his wife, Anna. She helps me with everything, and they want to adopt me." The crowd fell silent. Sarah began to sob, burying her face in the woman's shoulder. Mark opened the car door, ushered them inside, and they drove towards the city. Those who remained were embarrassed. The men nodded approvingly. Mark tiredly rubbed his nose. "Is it true, Mark, that you want to adopt Sarah?" asked one of the women in the crowd. "Yes, my wife and I don't have children of our own. We are willing to adopt Sarah as our own daughter," Vladimir Lvovich replied. Chris started cursing Mark, but in the end, the wealthy man made the decision to leave the village. A few days later, the police arrived at Chris's house, having learned that the deplorable man was willing to sell his own daughter for a cow. Ultimately, Chris was sent to prison, and Sarah began a new life with loving adoptive parents.